Hello and welcome to Trump Watch. I'm Parikshit Luthra. The news of the United States Supreme Court striking down President Donald Trump's tariffs imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act came as a major relief, with many businesses welcoming the prospect of recovering funds previously collected within hours. However, President Trump announced a new 10% tariff, raising it to 15% the following day, reviving the very uncertainty many believed the court's ruling had ended. While the Supreme Court's decision invalidated the use of IPA for those tariffs, it also made clear that clearer statutory authority, potentially granting broader, more explicit powers to the president, would be required going forward. Although the court ruling said that imposing tariffs under IPA was illegal, it stopped short of saying that the U.S. should refund the tariff revenue collected from businesses. Meanwhile, Trump warned that the refund process could remain stuck in court for the next 5 years. Reports state that refunds could be worth around $175 billion. Experts fear the refund process itself could be messy, with cases likely heading to the United States Court of International Trade. Reports suggest that more than 1,000 refund lawsuits have already been filed by importers, and this number is likely to rise in the coming days. So what happens now? Do businesses have viable legal options, or will there be renewed uncertainty? And will this make further legal challenges even harder to pursue? Joining us right now to take this forward is Gaurav Ganguly, Head of International Economics with Moody's Analytics, former Indian Ambassador Mohan Kumar as well. Ambassador Kumar, let me begin by asking you about the Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, which Donald Trump has used to first impose a 10% temporary tariff, then raising it to 15%. Can this stand legal scrutiny?
Thank you very much for having me, Parikshit. My sense is that this is legally a little bit on a shaky ground, mainly because Section 122 is mainly used for international payments problem. You need to have a balance of payments problem. And it's hard to argue that the United States has a balance of payments problem just now. But the fact of the matter is, this does not require prior investigation by any authority like the Commerce Department or the USTR. There is presidential authority which has been used to impose 15%. It can last 150 days. And really, by the time you make a legal case against it, take it to the courts, my sense is the 150 days will be gone. My assessment is the Trump administration is using it as a stopgap measure until it figures out whether they want to use much more long-standing instruments such as 301, the national security, which is 232, or even 338. And we will talk about it a little later. But the fact of the matter is, right now, this does not reduce uncertainty. It merely gives the Trump administration some breathing space, because nothing can be done about this 15%. And I sense that this will last about 150 days. By the time the cases reach the court, this would have become an academic thing, whether you want to oppose it or not.
All right. We're also joined by U.S. Attorney Greg Huzishan. Greg, thank you very much for joining us on the program. Greg, a partner at Foley Lardner LLP. Can people claim refunds right now? We believe there are thousands of lawsuits in the United States, but if countries try to do it at a government level, is there an option to do so?
No, governments cannot claim refunds. Refunds can only be claimed by the importer of record, which is the company that initially paid the tariffs. Usually that's going to be a U.S. company, although it's possible it could be a company from India.
Right. But Greg, what about trade deals? India, just about 2 weeks ago, had managed to agree upon a trade deal with the United States for an 18% reciprocal tariff. They had agreed upon a joint statement. The deal was supposed to be inked in March. What happens to that?
So in all likelihood, foreign governments are going to stick to the deals because they're going to be concerned that President Trump would retaliate if they withdrew from the deals. Although the IEEPA tariffs were invalidated, There's still a lot of trade authorities out there like Section 232 or 301 that might be a little bit more cumbersome and a little bit slower, but they still give the president a lot of discretion to impose tariffs. So in all likelihood, companies or countries are going to stick to the deals because they fear the uncertainty of what would happen if they did not.
Right. Gaurav, thank you for joining us as well. Does this inject a lot of uncertainty into the global trading system? Do you expect countries like India to sit back and just watch and observe what happens over the next 150 days?
Thank you for having me, Parikshit. Yes, I think it does inject some uncertainty into the global economic system, but I'd like to point out that this uncertainty is less than the uncertainty we had in mind or felt, definitely, after the Liberation Day announcements. The world has become used to the concept of tariffs from the US, and what we have seen from the administration is largely a continuation of what has been at least for the past few months. So uncertainty definitely on the rise here, but not to extreme levels. I would say that countries are definitely in watch and see mode. From the announcements we've heard from various administrations around the world, countries are looking to see what's going to happen. In some cases, such as the European Union, there is concern that they're actually going to be penalized a bit further. UK and Australia in the same boat. Country like India thinking, well, actually, it's going to benefit because tariffs are going to come down. But I would say that it's in every country's interest to get into a wait-and-see mode to see what happens. Many countries, as part of their trade deals, have made infeasible purchase and investment pledges. There will be every incentive now to just sit back and watch and see what happens and slow walk the ratification of these deals. Yes, the US has measures it can take, and yes, I'm sure that they will come back and try and penalize countries that do not ratify these trade deals, but they've also lost a certain amount of power as a result of the Supreme Court ruling. And if I were a country on the other side of a trade deal, right now, I'd be watching and waiting.
Okay, Ambassador Mohan Kumar, to get you back in, the Indian chief negotiator Darpan Jain was supposed to fly to Washington, D.C. this week to finalize the terms of the trade agreement, which would have to be legally signed by Jamieson Greer and Piyush Goyal in the month of March, in the middle of March. That's not happening. They've put off the visit for the moment. Should India try and negotiate better terms, or should they wait and watch? Will the Trump administration honor the terms agreed upon earlier?
I think I find it interesting that the visit by the chief negotiator from India has been put off by mutual agreement. I was very keen to watch whether India is postponing the visit unilaterally, or is it going to be done by mutual agreement. And I'm somewhat comforted that both sides talked and then they put out a joint statement saying both sides have agreed that this is not the time for the chief negotiator from India to go to the US, and that we will find another time to do it. Second, I echo the views of my co-panelists who just spoke. No question, everybody will wait and watch. Especially, this is a larger battle, Parikshit, on the major questions doctrine and the power of the Congress alone to impose tariffs. And I don't want to take time of your program, but there is a battle between the judiciary and the executive and the legislature. And this is a larger issue that will get sorted out over time, I suspect. And until that time, countries will be wary. As far as India is concerned, my mantra would be no reneging on the deal, which we agreed, at least in theory, but no finalization of the deal until we get some clarification. You don't want a situation where you agree to something with the US and then 3 months down the line, you see a Section 301 investigation against India. That is not something that India would want. So by and large, I see India essentially waiting and watching, but also trying to make a reassessment of the situation, in the sense there are areas where India sought 0% duty. And what happens to those? Do we get 0%? Despite this omnibus declaration by President Trump of 15%, or does it go back to 15%? Because that will make a difference to India's assessment of balance of benefits and concessions. But more than anything else, I would urge India to talk to the US so as to read their mind, get some solid assurance that, listen, if we do stick by the deal, then do we have predictability in terms of tariffs? You don't want a situation where after 150 days, you either go back to some other section. We don't have the time to talk of sections, but there is another section 338 in which there is no limit at all. And if the president were to use that section, which has never been used before, then if there is alleged discrimination against American commerce, then there is no limit to the tariffs that the president can impose. So I would say essentially wait and watch, but be in continuous dialogue with the US to seek clarity about whether we can stick to a deal which will then not be reneged by either side.
Right. Let me get in Greg once again. So, Greg, that indeed is the important question. If India sticks with this trade deal, where we concluded that the tariffs for Indian products going to the US will be at 18%, most US industrial goods and some agricultural items will become zero in India. India will also get zero duty access on certain products. Will Donald Trump be able to ensure that the deal continues on these terms after 150 days? Can he give some legal effect to this deal with India, which will further not get challenged in the US Supreme Court?
Well, first of all, anything he does on tariffs will be challenged and potentially go to the Supreme Court. I think there's two issues. One, it's a virtual certainty that there will be more Section 232 sectoral tariffs like we see on steel, aluminum, and copper. Anytime that there's some kind of national security angle, and we've seen that the president is treating them as, even when there's deals in place, that he can impose these sectoral tariffs. So that's one wild card to see how much the Section 232 sectoral tariffs expand. And the president can use Section 301 as a way to undergird the existing deal or as a way to punish companies that don't come to a deal. So my expectation is they're going to use Section 301, first of all, to go after countries that do not have a framework deal in place, and that in general, the president views the deals that have been struck as advantageous to the United States. So there's likely to be some stability with regard to the overall framework deal with India, taking into account that there may be some targeted tariffs that go after specific types of products under Section 232.
All right, we'll take a short break at this point, but I'll request all our guests, Ambassador Mohan Kumar, Gaurav Ganguly, and Greg, to stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Trump Watch, the discussion with Gaurav Ganguly of Moody's Analytics, Greg Hussein of Foley and Lardner, and former Indian diplomat Mohan Kumar continues. Gaurav, if I can ask you, do you expect the European Union and China to negotiate harder with the United States now?
I think that's a really interesting question because it's clear that China certainly has demonstrated its leverage in previous conversations with the US, and the EU is starting to become much more active in thinking about its leverage. So yes, I do think on both sides there is a case to be made here for both for the EU and for China to start to think about how to address this issue of negotiating with the US, knowing full well that the US now has its hands tied a bit. I'll take the example of secondary tariffs, which the US has been quite quick to use with regards to India, levying 25%, 50% because India's purchases of Russian oil. This sort of use of tariffs is going to be much harder now. And that's going to make it easier for big powers such as the EU and China to think about approaching the US the way they want to conduct their negotiation. However, I think on both sides, certainly in the short term, there is going to be an element of watchfulness, waiting to see what develops next, trying to understand the next moves the administration might make, how it may come back to these areas with further tariffs under Section 301, 232, etc. But yes, I think it's clear to say that these big powers will feel that they're in a stronger position.
All right, let me go back to Greg at this point. Greg, in terms of refunds, the Reuters agency reported on the 20th of February that the Supreme Court decision striking down the IPA tariffs made more than $175 billion in U.S. Treasury revenue generated by IPA subject to potential refunds. Will the Trump administration resort to some laws to prevent these refunds from taking place?
So the Supreme Court decision did not mention the word refunds. Instead, it sent it back to the Court of International Trade to consider that issue. And it is likely that the administration is going to push back on refunds because President Trump views them as very important and has promised them to be used in different ways to help reduce the deficit, to help farmers, and all sorts of different ways. So we expect that there's going to be another round of fighting over the refunds and that the issue potentially will go back to the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit and back to the Supreme Court to consider again. But in the long run, it's hard to see how the US government can keep tariffs that were collected under a law that the Supreme Court has said doesn't support the tariffs. And so the fact that the administration used IEPA rather than other tariff authorities could turn out to mean that the US government can't keep the money. But it's going to be a long fight of probably a year or more until we know the answer to that.
Right. Ambassador Mohan Kumar, clearly this is a period of uncertainty for exporters for whom contracts are usually for 6 to 7 months. So even for people who are buying Indian products in the US, this will inject a certain amount of uncertainty. But behind the scenes, what do you think are the kind of clarifications the Indian government would be seeking from the United States?
So before I come to the clarification, let me say this. One of the ironic impacts of the Supreme Court judgment and the President Trumpian, resort to Section 122 is that countries which were on the mat, like China and Brazil, and to some extent India, now find themselves in a relatively better position. And countries which had negotiated a deal and thought they had a good deal, like the UK, EU, South Korea, and others, now suddenly find that these don't suit them so much because they had actually undertaken to invest a certain amount of money, buy Boeing aircrafts, etc., to get the tariff down to 10%. In the case of UK, and in the case of EU, 15%. So actually in the European Union, there is a tremendous demand in the European Parliament now to completely renegotiate the deal. It has not been ratified by the European Parliament, and they're saying, why do you want to ratify a deal like this? China, on the other hand, is relatively better off after this than before the Supreme Court judgment. So my assessment is China will make some noise, but it's not too badly off compared to before. And in any case, they will not do anything. Neither side will do anything to disrupt the all important meeting between President Trump and Xi Jinping scheduled to take place in March. As far as India is concerned, I think we are not in such a bad situation compared to several others, but I would urge that we continue to negotiate with the United States, seek as much clarity and assurance as possible in the circumstances, if nothing else, to ward off future 301 or 232 assessments. The most important thing, Parikshit, is pharmaceuticals and electronics right now enjoy 0%, and they should remain that way. 50% of Indian exports are okay as of today. They continue to be okay while we seek concessions for other areas like textiles and garments and shrimps and so on. So, all in all, India is not in dire straits, but we need to seek some assurance so that there is predictability and security for Indian exporters in a market that constitutes 20% of Indian exports.
All right. Thank you very much, Ambassador Mohan Kumar, Greg, and Gaurav Ganguly for being with us here on the program. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of News Center. More news and updates continue right here.